First Contact and Fatal Assumptions. The Kalari Empire's first glimpse of Earth came through the crystalline displays of their long-range scout vessel, the Eternal Dawn. High Commander Zorix stood motionless, his iridescent scales reflecting the soft blue glow of the holographic projections. His 4 eyes narrowed as he studied the readings from this unremarkable solar system's third planet. Another primitive civilization, he noted, mandibles clicking in mild amusement. Their electromagnetic emissions suggest they've barely mastered basic digital technology. He gestured to his subordinate, "Show me their military capabilities." The display shifted, showing Earth's defensive systems, weapons platforms, and military installations. The Kalari artificial intelligence had categorized Earth as a Type II civilization on their conquest scale, technologically advanced enough to pose a minor challenge, but not sufficient to warrant their full military might. What the Kalari's advanced sensors failed to detect was humanity's greatest weapon, their absolute refusal to accept defeat. The invasion began exactly as planned. The Kalari fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their ships' crystalline hulls gleaming in Earth's sunlight. Their first strike disabled global communications and key military installations with surgical precision. Humanity's primitive missile defense systems couldn't even track their ships, let alone harm them. High Commander Zorix watched with satisfaction as his forces secured their initial objectives. The humans' organized military response was exactly what their simulations had predicted: predictable, limited by their technology, and ultimately futile. Their aircraft fell from the sky, their tanks reduced to molten slag, their ships sunk beneath the waves. The first hint that something was wrong came during what should have been a routine occupation of a mid-sized human city. The Kalari ground forces, encased in their powered armor suits, had moved in to secure the population center. Their orders were standard: establish control, minimize civilian casualties, demonstrate overwhelming force to prevent resistance. Squad leader Terex led his unit down the empty streets, their sensors scanning for threats. The silence should have been their first warning. Movement detected, one of his soldiers reported. Multiple heat signatures in the structures ahead. Terex raised his crystalline weapon, expecting to find cowering humans or perhaps a foolish last stand by local law enforcement. Instead, the attack came from below. The street beneath their feet suddenly collapsed, sending 3 of his soldiers plummeting into a prepared pit. Before they could activate their gravity compensators, a deluge of what their sensors identified as common household chemicals poured down on them. The mixture ate through their armor's crystalline components like acid. Simultaneous attacks erupted from all directions. Humans emerged from hidden positions, wielding improvised weapons that defied military classification. They fought with tools meant for construction, sports equipment wrapped in electrified wire, and crude explosives made from fertilizer and fuel. "Impossible," Terex transmitted as his squad was overwhelmed. "They're using primitive weapons. But the patterns, there's no pattern. The humans didn't fight like soldiers. They didn't maintain formations or follow any recognizable military doctrine. They struck from shadows, disappeared into underground tunnels, and used their intimate knowledge of their city's infrastructure to devastating effect." High Commander Zorix received similar reports from across the globe. In the Arctic, Kalari troops found their advanced thermal regulation systems frozen solid by liquid nitrogen stolen from medical facilities. In dense urban areas, humans turned their own living spaces into deadly maze-like traps. In the deserts, their patrols disappeared into suddenly appearing sandstorms, only to be found later, their equipment stripped and repurposed. "They're adapting too quickly," his strategic AI warned. "Human resistance tactics are evolving at 16 times the predicted rate. They're learning to exploit vulnerabilities in our technology that they shouldn't even be able to comprehend." Zorix dismissed these early setbacks. The Kalari Empire had conquered hundreds of worlds. Their technology was centuries ahead of Earth's. Victory was inevitable. But as the days turned to weeks, the reports became increasingly disturbing. A Kalari forward base went dark after locals introduced a computer virus through the seemingly innocent act of surrendering an Earth laptop as a peace offering. The virus, primitive by Kalari standards, succeeded precisely because of its primitiveness. It was so basic it bypassed their advanced cybersecurity entirely. In another instance, humans disabled a Kalari walker unit by launching hundreds of small drones equipped with nothing more than commercial cameras and simple electromagnetic pulse devices. The drones were laughably easy to shoot down, but there were simply too many. The humans had weaponized their own disposable technology. Most disturbing was humanity's psychological warfare. They didn't break under overwhelming force, they became more creative, more determined. They turned their own cities into weapons, their infrastructure into traps, their civilian technology into military assets. They're not fighting to win, one of Zorix's analysts finally realized. They're fighting because they don't know how to stop. Our presence isn't subduing them, it's teaching them how to fight us better. As the first month of the invasion drew to a close, High Commander Zorix stood before his tactical display, watching as more red indicators signaled lost units and failed operations. His perfect invasion plan was falling apart, not because of superior technology or brilliant military strategy, but because humans simply refused to behave like a proper conquered species. They had expected to find a primitive civilization. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous: humanity's unlimited capacity for adaptation, innovation, and sheer stubborn defiance. The adaptable enemy. The Kalari Empire's grand invasion was unraveling in ways their tactical computers couldn't process. High Commander Zorix studied the latest battle footage with growing unease. The scene showed a Kalari patrol in what humans called New York City, their crystalline armor gleaming under streetlights. Then, without warning, the entire street went dark. What happened next defied military logic. Dozens of humans on wheeled devices, skateboards, and roller blades, according to intelligence, emerged from the darkness. They moved with impossible speed through the Kalari formation, attaching crude electromagnetic devices to the aliens' armor. The patrol's advanced targeting systems, designed to track hypersonic missiles, couldn't lock onto targets moving so erratically at such close range. Primitive doesn't mean stupid, Zorix muttered, mandibles clicking in frustration. It means unpredictable. Across the globe, humanity's resistance evolved with terrifying speed. In Japan, civilians turned their extensive tunnel systems into death traps for Kalari forces. Advanced motion sensors were rendered useless by the simple trick of releasing thousands of cats and dogs into the tunnels, creating so much biological noise that Kalari troops couldn't distinguish human movements from animal ones. The humans called it using what you have. The Kalari called it madness. In Brazil's dense urban favelas, resistance fighters painted their buildings in chaotic patterns that confused Kalari optical systems. They strung up thousands of mirrors and LEDs, creating a disorienting maze of light that made their advanced targeting systems worse than useless. When Kalari commanders switched to thermal imaging, the humans simply set fires everywhere, turning the heat signatures into meaningless data. They're not just adapting to our technology, reported senior analyst Vex, her scales shifting to a worried purple hue. They're forcing us to adapt to them. This isn't how conquest is supposed to work. The situation in rural areas proved even more challenging. Kalari forces found their anti-gravity vehicles disabled by simple metal cables strung between trees. Their energy shields, designed to stop plasma weapons, proved useless against primitive projectiles moving below the shield's minimum activation threshold. Farmers turned agricultural equipment into weapons, their intimate knowledge of the land turning every field into a potential battlefield. Most concerning was humanity's ability to reverse engineer Kalari technology. Not through sophisticated analysis, but through brutal trial and error. They didn't need to understand how something worked, they just needed to figure out how to break it. They captured one of our fallen scouts, a field commander reported from Australia. Within days, they discovered that our crystalline armor becomes brittle when exposed to specific sound frequencies. Now they're using modified sound systems from something called rock concerts to shatter our defensive systems. The humans' communication methods proved equally baffling. When the Kalari shut down their global internet, resistance groups simply reverted to older technologies, radio, Morse code, even paper notes carried by civilians. Their messages were primitive, usually unencrypted, but the sheer volume of civilian communications made it impossible to distinguish resistance signals from background noise. In orbit, Kalari ships began detecting strange anomalies. Humans were launching thousands of small objects into low orbit, space debris, according to initial scans. It wasn't until several ships reported hull damage that they realized the truth. The humans were turning their own space junk into a weapon, creating debris fields that forced Kalari ships to either maintain expensive shields continuously or risk death by 1,000 cuts. They're using our strengths against us, Zorix realized during a strategic meeting. Our technology requires precision, clean environments, predictable conditions. They're turning their whole planet into chaos. The psychological impact on Kalari troops was becoming severe. They had been trained to fight organized armies, not an entire species that treated military doctrine as optional. Human civilians would surrender, only to become resistance fighters the moment Kalari guards lowered their guard. Every piece of Earth technology, no matter how primitive, was a potential weapon. In India, resistance fighters discovered that Kalari sensors could be fooled by large crowds moving in unpredictable patterns. They organized massive flash mobs, thousands of civilians suddenly gathering, dancing chaotically, then dispersing just as quickly. Hidden within these crowds, resistance fighters could move freely, their movements masked by the sea of bodies. They're not just fighting us, one psychological warfare expert noted. They're enjoying it. Every victory, no matter how small, is celebrated. They're turning their resistance into a form of cultural expression. The Kalari Empire had conquered species that were more technologically advanced than humans. They had defeated civilizations with superior weapons, better strategies, and more resources. But they had never encountered a species that treated warfare like an art form, that adapted not just their tactics but their entire way of life to resist invasion. Reports from medical units became increasingly concerning. Kalari soldiers were developing anxiety disorders, jumping at shadows, seeing potential weapons in every human object. The psychological advantage that should have belonged to the invaders had somehow shifted to the defenders. As the second month of the invasion began, High Commander Zorix faced an uncomfortable reality. The Empire's technological superiority, their greatest advantage, had become a liability. Their soldiers were too specialized, their weapons too sophisticated, their tactics too rigid. The humans, in contrast, were the ultimate generalists. They turned toys into weapons, streets into battlefields, and their own technological limitations into strategic advantages. They didn't need to match Kalari technology, they simply needed to make that technology unusable. Looking at the latest casualty reports, Zorix realized that the Empire had made a fundamental error. They had evaluated Earth based on its technology, its military capabilities, its resources. They should have been evaluating its people's capacity for adaptation, their creativity under pressure, and their seemingly infinite ability to transform everything around them into tools of resistance. The question was no longer how to win the war. The question was whether the Empire could afford to continue fighting it. Breaking point. The first major defeat of the Kalari Empire came not from a decisive battle, but from something their military strategists had never considered: boredom. Human resistance fighters discovered that Kalari troops, for all their advanced technology and training, couldn't maintain focus during long periods of apparent inactivity. "They're cracking," reported Field Commander Lysix from what remained of Chicago. "The humans, they're playing with us. Yesterday, they spent 6 hours making strange noises outside our perimeter. When we finally investigated, we found nothing but primitive audio devices. While we were distracted, they hit our main supply depot. High Commander Zorix's scales shifted to a deep red as he reviewed the latest catastrophe. The humans had turned psychological warfare into an art form, but not through sophisticated manipulation. Instead, they employed what they called trolling, a concept so foreign to Kalari military doctrine that their cultural analysts were still struggling to define it. In London, resistance fighters began staging elaborate fake surrenders, complete with white flags and tearful speeches. When Kalari troops moved in to accept the surrender, they'd find nothing but mannequins and recorded messages mocking their gullibility. The real attacks would come hours later, when the troops were exhausted from maintaining high alert. "They're not just fighting us," psychological warfare expert Nex observed, her voice trembling. "They're amusing themselves. Every defeat we suffer becomes part of their cultural narrative. They're turning our invasion into entertainment." The breaking point for many Kalari units came from the humans' complete disregard for conventional military behavior. In Seoul, resistance fighters organized what appeared to be a mass dance celebration in front of a Kalari stronghold. Thousands of civilians performed synchronized movements while wearing matching outfits, a K-pop flash mob, according to intel. The display was so bizarre that Kalari commanders couldn't decide if it was a diversion or mass hysteria. By the time they realized the dancers were mapping their defense patterns, it was too late. The humans' ability to coordinate without apparent coordination proved devastating. They developed a system they called mimetic warfare, spreading tactical information through seemingly nonsensical cultural references. Kalari intelligence officers intercepted thousands of images of cats with funny captions, only to realize too late that the captions contained coded instructions for resistance operations. "They're using their own cognitive limitations as weapons," strategic analyst Vex reported. "Their communication systems are so primitive, so cluttered with meaningless data, that finding actual intelligence is impossible. It's like trying to find a specific drop of water in an ocean of chaos." The situation in orbit became equally problematic. Humans began broadcasting what they called space memes, deliberate nonsense signals that confused Kalari communication systems. Their AI filters, designed to identify meaningful patterns, began to malfunction as they tried to analyze millions of intentionally meaningless transmissions. But the true breaking point came from humanity's most powerful weapon, their ability to learn from failure. Unlike the Kalari, who saw failure as shameful, humans celebrated their mistakes as learning opportunities. Every failed resistance operation provided new insights, every defeated tactic led to 3 new innovations. "They're treating warfare like scientific research," Zorix realized with growing horror. But instead of controlling variables, they're intentionally introducing chaos. They're running millions of combat experiments simultaneously, with no regard for efficiency or losses. In what became known as the Melbourne Massacre, a Kalari elite unit was completely annihilated by what appeared to be untrained civilians using sports equipment. The humans had discovered that cricket bats, when wrapped in certain earth metals, could disrupt the energy field harmonics of Kalari armor. They didn't need to understand the physics, they just needed to know it worked. The psychological impact on Kalari troops reached crisis levels. Soldiers began reporting what they called human syndrome, paranoid beliefs that every Earth object, no matter how harmless it appeared, could be a weapon. They weren't wrong. In Rome, resistance fighters turned ancient catacombs into 3-dimensional battlegrounds, using centuries-old tunnels to move invisibly beneath Kalari positions. In Moscow, they weaponized the weather itself, using their knowledge of the city's snow patterns to bury Kalari sensors in false readings. Their primitive nature was supposed to be a weakness, Zorix muttered during an emergency command meeting. Instead, it's their greatest strength. They're not bound by technological limitations, they're liberated by them. The Empire's advanced combat simulations, which had predicted a swift victory, now produced only error messages when trying to model human behavior. The humans weren't just thinking outside the box, they were denying the existence of the box itself. In orbit, Kalari ships began experiencing unexplainable equipment failures. Human hackers, using computers that should have been hopelessly primitive, found ways to inject nonsense data into Kalari systems. They couldn't break the encryption, so they simply overloaded it with garbage data until something broke. "They're not trying to win battles," realized Senior Commander Rax, shortly before his position was overrun by humans using modified construction equipment. "They're trying to make the cost of victory too high. Every day we stay, they learn more about us. Every victory teaches them how to defeat us more efficiently." The final straw came during what should have been a routine operation in what humans called Texas. A Kalari strike force, equipped with the Empire's most advanced weapons, was completely neutralized by locals using a combination of barbecue smokers, modified farm equipment, and something called football tackle training. Looking at the casualty reports, Zorix faced an uncomfortable truth. The Empire wasn't just losing soldiers and equipment, they were losing their understanding of how warfare worked. Everything they knew about military doctrine, about the logical progression of combat, was being systematically dismantled by humans who refused to acknowledge those doctrines existed. The breaking point wasn't a single moment, but a slow realization that spread through the Kalari forces like a virus. They weren't fighting a war anymore. They were participants in humanity's crash course in interstellar combat, and the humans were proving to be terrifyingly quick learners. The question was no longer whether the Empire could win. The question was how much of their military doctrine would survive contact with a species that treated the impossible as merely inconvenient. The tables turn. High Commander Zorix stood in stunned silence as he watched the impossible unfold on his command screen. A human vessel, if it could even be called that, was approaching one of his mighty battlecruisers. The craft appeared to be cobbled together from salvaged Kalari technology and Earth materials, its hull a patchwork of crystalline panels and what sensors identified as recycled shipping containers. "Surely they're not serious," he muttered. Then the human ship opened fire. The weapon wasn't elegant. It wasn't even properly engineered. The humans had simply taken a captured Kalari energy cannon, wrapped it in coolant systems stolen from their planet's data centers, and powered it with dozens of their primitive nuclear reactors linked together. It was crude, dangerous, and should not have worked. The battlecruiser's shields collapsed under the barrage. "They're not just copying our technology," strategic analyst Vex observed, her scales pale with shock. "They're stripping it down and rebuilding it without any regard for proper engineering principles. They're treating our most advanced systems like building blocks." The humans had turned their fundamental understanding of the universe upside down. Where Kalari technology relied on precision and theoretical perfection, humans embraced chaos and imperfection. They didn't try to master alien technology, they bullied it into working through sheer stubborn determination. In orbit, more hybrid vessels appeared. Earth's governments had pooled their resources, combining captured Kalari tech with their own industrial capacity. They called them Frankenship-class vessels, a reference Zorix didn't understand but found disturbing nonetheless. The human ships shouldn't have been spaceworthy. Their designs violated dozens of fundamental engineering principles. They were ugly, inefficient, and terrifyingly effective. When Kalari ships disabled their crude shields, the humans would simply vent their reactor coolant into space, creating clouds of frozen particles that fouled sensor systems and energy weapons alike. "They're not fighting like a spacefaring civilization," Zorix realized. "They're fighting like a species that just discovered fire and decided to see what else they could burn." On the ground, the situation was even worse. Humans had reverse-engineered Kalari personal shields, not by understanding the technology, but by systematically testing different ways to make them fail. They discovered that wearing the shields inside out created feedback loops that turned the defensive devices into crude but effective explosive devices. In what became known as the Silicon Valley Incident, a group of human technology companies pooled their resources to create what they called a bootleg version of Kalari combat AI. The system was horrifically crude by Empire standards, but it could process information in ways Kalari computers couldn't predict. It didn't think better than Kalari AI, it thought wrong in just the right ways. "They're not advancing," reported Field Commander Lysix from the ruins of his command post. "They're regressing. But they're doing it with our technology. Every time we think we understand their capabilities, they find new ways to use our own weapons against us that shouldn't be possible." The humans had learned that Kalari energy weapons became unstable when exposed to certain frequencies. Rather than avoiding using the weapons, they intentionally induced the instability, creating what they called dubstep guns, weapons that fired unpredictable bursts of energy while playing what Zorix could only describe as weaponized noise. In orbit, human ships began using their planet's dense satellite networks as impromptu defense grids. They didn't need sophisticated targeting systems, they simply calculated rough trajectories and filled space with so much debris that Kalari ships couldn't maneuver without taking damage. "They're turning their technological limitations into tactical advantages," Zorix observed. "Our ships can't operate in such cluttered conditions without risking damage. Their ships are already damaged by design, they have nothing to lose." The humans' approach to electronic warfare was equally baffling. Unable to crack Kalari encryption, they instead created programs that generated massive amounts of nonsense data. They called it shitposting, overwhelming Kalari communication systems with so much garbage data that legitimate signals couldn't get through. But perhaps most disturbing was humanity's ability to innovate in real time. During the Battle of Sydney, human forces lost half their hybrid weapons to a new Kalari defense system. Within hours, they had not only adapted but had turned the defense system's own energy signatures against it. They didn't bother understanding why it worked, they just knew it did. "Every victory we achieve teaches them something new," psychological warfare expert Nex reported, her voice trembling. "They're not just learning our weaknesses, they're learning how to think like us while still fighting like themselves." The turning point came during what humans later called the Great Reverse Uno, a reference that Kalari cultural experts still couldn't fully explain. Human forces launched what appeared to be a desperate attack on a Kalari fleet anchorage, using ships that were little more than engines and shields cobbled together. The Kalari commanders, following standard doctrine, activated their point defense systems. Too late, they realized the human ships were designed to break apart under fire. Each piece was a crude but effective bomb, turning the defensive fire into a mechanism for spreading the weapons across the target area. "They're not trying to match our technology," Zorix finally understood. "They're trying to make our technology irrelevant. Every system we deploy, every tactic we use, becomes a new tool in their arsenal, not because they understand it, but because they don't care about understanding it." Looking at the tactical display, now showing dozens of human hybrid ships emerging from behind their moon, Zorix felt a sensation he had never experienced in centuries of military service: doubt. The Empire had always assumed that technological superiority guaranteed victory. The humans weren't just proving that assumption wrong, they were systematically dismantling the very concept of technological superiority. They weren't fighting the war the Empire had prepared for. They were fighting the war they wanted to fight, using rules they made up as they went along. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been flipped, broken down, and reassembled into weapons that defied proper military classification. Victory through chaos. The final phase of Earth's defense began not with a grand battle, but with what humans called a practical joke on a cosmic scale. They had discovered that Kalari quantum communication systems, which relied on perfect signal clarity, could be disrupted by generating massive amounts of entangled particles in chaotic patterns. Their solution? Turn the entire planet into what they called a quantum meme generator. They're doing what? High Commander Zorix demanded, his scales shifting through colors that didn't have names in human languages. They're using their particle accelerators to shitpost into the quantum realm, strategic analyst Vex reported, struggling with the human terminology. Our fleet's communication systems are being overwhelmed by quantum noise that appears to be mostly pictures of something called cats and Rick Astley. The humans had discovered that they couldn't beat Kalari technology through superior engineering. Instead, they opted to crash the entire system through concentrated absurdity. Their planet's scientists, freed from the constraints of proper theoretical frameworks, were introducing chaos into fundamental forces of the universe. They're not just fighting against our invasion, psychological warfare expert Nex observed, her voice hollow. They're fighting against the laws of physics themselves. And somehow, they're making the laws of physics back down. The Kalari Empire's final offensive was meant to be overwhelming, a display of force that would finally break human resistance. Instead, it became a masterclass in everything wrong with fighting humans. As the Empire's Grand Fleet moved into position, they detected no major human military response. Instead, their sensors picked up millions of small objects launching from Earth's surface. Space junk, according to initial scans. Debris from previous battles. Nothing threatening. Then the objects started broadcasting. Millions of crude transmitters, each playing different frequencies of what humans called music. The cacophony overwhelmed Kalari sensor systems, creating a shield of pure noise that their targeting computers couldn't penetrate. Behind this wall of acoustic chaos, human ships moved with impunity. They're using our precision against us, Zorix realized. Our systems are designed to find patterns, to analyze data. They're giving us too many patterns, too much data. They're drowning us in information. But the humans weren't done. As Kalari ships struggled to navigate through the cloud of broadcasting debris, new signals appeared. The humans had turned their entire satellite network into a distributed electronic warfare platform. Each satellite was crude, its emissions barely powerful enough to register on Kalari sensors. There were just so many of them. They're not trying to jam our communications, a technical analyst reported, mandibles clicking in distress. They're trying to talk them to death. Each satellite is attempting to initiate first contact protocols. Our AI is required to respond to each one individually. They're doing our diplomacy subroutines. The combined effect of quantum disruption, acoustic interference, and diplomatic spam brought the mighty Kalari fleet to a standstill. But for humans, a standstill was just another word for target practice. Their hybrid ships emerged from the chaos like predators, each one a violation of proper engineering principles. They had taken the Empire's elegant technology and turned it into something that looked like it had been designed by caffeinated engineers during a fever dream. Some human ships were powered by what appeared to be deliberately unstable reactor cores, using their own imminent destruction as a weapon. Others had replaced proper shield generators with arrays of small projectors, creating overlapping fields that flickered and shifted unpredictably. They're not just adapting anymore, Zorix observed as another Kalari cruiser fell to human asymmetric tactics. They're evolving. Every technology we use against them becomes part of their arsenal, but twisted into forms we never imagined. The humans had learned that Kalari ships relied on predictive algorithms for defense. Their solution wasn't to develop better algorithms, but to behave so erratically that prediction became impossible. Their attacks followed no pattern, their formations defied tactical analysis, and their weapons seemed designed specifically to make Kalari combat computers crash. In what became known as the final fuck you, a term that would later require 300 pages of cultural context to explain to the Empire's historians, humanity revealed their ultimate weapon, weaponized cooperation. Nations that had been enemies for centuries united not through careful diplomacy, but through shared appreciation of how much fun it was to confuse aliens. Ancient rivalries were set aside not for noble causes, but because everyone wanted to be part of the biggest practical joke in human history. They're not just fighting as a species, psychological warfare expert Nex reported, her analysis now bordering on existential crisis. They're treating the entire war like a global team-building exercise. They're bonding over our confusion. The final battle wasn't really a battle at all. Human forces didn't try to destroy the Kalari fleet, they simply made it impossible for the fleet to function. Every frequency was jammed with noise, every computer system bombarded with nonsense data, every tactical doctrine rendered meaningless by humans who treated military strategy like a game where they could make up new rules. Standing on his command deck, watching as the mighty Kalari armada was rendered combat ineffective by what humans called trolling, High Commander Zorix finally understood the Empire's fundamental mistake. They had evaluated humanity based on their technology, their military capability, their industrial capacity. They should have been evaluating their creativity, their adaptability, and their apparently infinite capacity to find joy in confusion. The order to retreat wasn't a difficult decision. It was the only possible response to a species that had turned warfare into performance art, that had weaponized their own limitations, and that seemed to be enjoying themselves far too much while doing it. As the Kalari fleet withdrew from Earth orbit, their sensors detected one final transmission. It was being broadcast on all frequencies, in perfect Kalari language. Thanks for the technology upgrade. Please come back when you have something new for us to break. P.S. We're keeping the ships we captured. We have plans for them that probably violate several laws of physics. The Kalari Empire had lost more than a war. They had lost their understanding of how warfare worked. They had encountered a species that didn't just think outside the box, they had stolen the box, turned it into a weapon, and used it to rewrite the rules of engagement. In the end, humanity's greatest victory wasn't defeating the Kalari Empire. It was proving that their way of thinking, chaotic, creative, and eternally adaptable, was a force more powerful than any technology. The galaxy would never be the same. And somewhere on Earth, humans were already planning how to turn this victory into what they called memes. The war was over. The chaos was just beginning.